Firstly, thanks to Hildegund and Simona and everybody for inviting me, and thanks very much for the contributions so far, particularly to Shuddha, which I found important as a sort of poetic politics in a way, a combination of these two, which I think I'm not going to live up to at all, because it will be much more of a sort of working class description of actual activities in a way, and that's partly what we were asked to do, I think, to look at a particular case study. So it's difficult to, I would say, to collapse in a way a whole talk about demodern into 15 minutes. So I'm not going to try and do that, but I hope that the question of the demodern as one response to the challenge of decoloniality and the heritage of colonization might be something that we can return to. I really appreciated Marina talking about speaking from a place, and so I'm going to try and speak from perhaps in some senses a very difficult, does it not work? Is that okay? Yeah? In some ways quite a difficult place to talk from, which is West Europe, because the Western European legacy is one which has always universalized itself. And so when you try and locate yourself within West Europe, you have the 500 years of colonialism, which comes as a weight on your shoulders. And how much you can locate yourself here is, I think, one of the challenges that we have. And it's a particular provincial challenge of West Europe, which might also apply to Austria in some senses, although Austria has a different internal colonial history to the external transatlantic, particularly, and trans-Pacific, eventually, colonial histories of the western seaboard of Eurasia, we can say, because Europe isn't really a continent. Yeah, we have to also understand, I think, that it's only a continent in the minds of those people that constructed it. And those early maps of Gondawara showed us the extent to which these continents are fictions rather than geographic conditions. The title of the so I'm going to try and speak from there, and in speaking from there, I hope we can see that, in a sense, I'm not looking to make Europe into a kind of utopia. A utopia which was a European invention done in 1513, only about 20 years after Columbus set sail to discover India and comes across a whole other place instead. Or not to discover India, to find India and discovers something else instead, discovers in inverted commas. 20 years later, starting in Antwerp, this book about utopia is written. And in a sense, this idea of utopia, no place, is precisely the problem that as Europeans, as West Europeans, we have about speaking, because we inherit not only a history of slavery, transatlantic slave trade, particularly a history of colonialism, a history of oppression, but we also inherit an intellectual history in which there's a universalizing of the particularities of this corner of the world. And that, for me, is the question in running a museum that I'm most interested in dealing with. The title of this talk relates to transcultural artistic exchange and what kind of models there might be. I think it's important to say that transcultural artistic exchange is happening whether we like it or not, and we don't necessarily need any kind of models because it's simply happening in the doing, in the being. And partly that's happening, I think we need to take account because of the changes that have happened in the last 50 years or so, even less actually. If you think that literacy rates on the planet have gone up from 50% in around 1980 to 82% in 2015. That's a huge increase relative to a literacy rate of 500 years when it went from more or less zero. Obviously, there was a, say 10% maximum to 50%. In the last 30, 40 years, another 30-odd% of the world's population, a population which is also doubling every generation almost. That process has meant that there's a huge number of people who can speak. So that's not only literacy. Literacy also measures, to some extent, education, obviously. To some extent, also measures of extreme poverty, which have, despite the inequalities of capitalism, the manifest inequalities of capitalism, the unsustainability of capitalism, have nevertheless produced reduced levels of extreme poverty across much of the world. At that point, more people can speak. Simply, more people can speak to each other. Technology obviously also aids this, yeah? Social media, etc. So at that point, transcultural artistic exchange happens. So the question, to some extent, at least for somebody like me, is what do I do about that? Not how do I develop a model to promote it, but how on earth, to some extent, do I control it? Yeah? Museums are famously gatekeepers. So actually, my role is much more a policing role, I think, unhappily though I might be to admit it, than it is a role of trying to construct those transcultural artistic exchanges. So I think that they occur anyway. But when speaking about Europe, and perhaps just to end on this idea of the specificities of Europe and why transcultural artistic exchange is difficult from our point of view, there's a very nice quote by a Uruguayan writer, Eduardo Galeano, who writes very, very short texts. He died, also a journalist. But in one text, which is called Euro Everything, in a book called Mirrors, which was published in the 1990s, he talks about the legacies of Europe. And at one sentence, he says, Europe looked in the mirror and saw the world. Beyond that lay nothing. This is a critique of European recognition of its own histories. And I think that's the legacy that we are carrying. So when we say, what does it mean to decolonize Europe? It means to start to understand what looking in the mirror and seeing the world might actually mean. And that, for me, at least in this museum, which we will go on, I'll skip this, in this museum, which you'll see here opening in 1936, the legacy of looking in the mirror and seeing the world is encoded in the whole collection of this institution. So in order to stop doing that, we have to do something about that history. Now, I think there are many other ways in which we can encourage transcultural artistic exchange. I think there are hugely important initiatives which can take place in terms of collaboration between the Western Europe as it tries to redefine itself to become, if you like, a place in the world rather than the place in the world. And in that process, there are many different tactics. For me, running this institution, one tactic feels to me to be to look at that legacy, particularly of modernism that we have here, and by extension of modernism, which is something we can say started around 1848, by extension, modernity itself, which I think we can date to 1492. If we want to be precise, to the beginnings of colonialism in that form. Remember, 1492 is an interesting date. It's also, in January 1492, is the last Moorish kingdom, Granada, falls, and the end of the presence in Western Europe of the Islamic tradition. And in November, Columbus is given permission by Isabella, and she actually says this at the time. Queen Isabella says, let's get rid of the Moors first, and then we can send you off. So there's a direct connection between this purification of Europe, this looking in the mirror and seeing the world, and the beginnings of colonialism itself. And that's the legacy that's encoded, I think, in this museum. So what do we do about that? Well, one thing I think is to recognize the fact that this looking in the mirror is a very subjective, a white supremacist, we might say, position. Because this institution, I'm going completely the wrong way. This institution is built on these women's labor. Because Henri Van Abbe, was a tobacco manufacturer. And as a tobacco manufacturer, he earned the money that bought the collection, that built the building, from Sumatra and West Java. East Java, near Surabaya. So these are the plantations. And one of the responses to that is simply to make sure that we always have in the building itself, and this is one small example, the presence of that history. Yeah? It's to say that we are as much, if you like, a Dutch East Indian and Indonesian institution as we are a Netherlandish institution. Yeah? That we belong, and the contemporary artists of Indonesia have as much right to be present in this institution as the Dutch, which is not to say that either necessarily has a right, but nevertheless that the rights are equivalent, that there's no way in which we can say this institution should prioritize Dutch artists alone, because its foundations are dependent upon the labor that was produced in the Dutch Empire and by colonialism. So that recognition within this small institution is important. But we're also struggling against different kinds of modernist legacy, and I'm just going to do two very quick examples, because I think it's important when we talk about colonialism, we think about the transatlantic slave trade, we think about the conquest of those spaces which are out with Europe. But I think increasingly it's interesting to think about particularly standing in Austria, it's interesting to think about internal European colonization and the relationships between those two. Because in the end, what happens if we do that is we are able, I think, to start to tie in, which is the legacy of this place, the histories of the Holocaust, to the histories of colonialism everywhere. And I think one of the mistakes of the European Union, one of the mistakes of history is that the never again, the nie wieder, which was proclaimed in 1945, was a nie wieder to Nazism, to National Socialism, perhaps to fascism, but not to colonialism. Colonialism was not the issue. The issue was not Europe as a whole not repeating its white supremacists looking in the mirror and seeing the world. It was to a very specific kind of colonialism, an extreme form of colonialism. It's the pinnacle in many ways, we can say, but nevertheless not unrelated to those other histories. And I think one thing that the museum can do is to try and build those relationships again so that Europe can understand itself. And it's not only German guilt or specific guilt, but it's a relationship of connections which have produced the mindset that we have now and produced the consequences that we see all around us in the reaction to the demographic changes, if you like, that are going on in Europe today. And so this is a kind of image which in a way talks more, as much to me as Columbus does in a way, about colonialism. Yeah? These are the great powers gathering in Albania to divide up Albania after the Ottoman retreat without any Albanians being present, where the great powers which we know are Britain, not Austria I'm afraid, but Britain, France and Russia, in this case, which are dividing up. No, Austria must have been there actually. Austria, the K&K, yeah, must have been there at that time. But that those states there are dividing it up without any understanding of the land itself. Yeah? So they're just drawing marks, and these drawings of marks, which have consequences now in the Balkans, ongoing consequences, are constructed here by a Europe, and this is then a particular Europe that looks in the mirror and sees the world. And maybe to relate that to our own practice. How long do I have more? Another 3 minutes? 5, okay, thank you. Maybe to relate that to a more pertinent idea for us, this is Herbert Bayer in 1930, drawing an eye without a head. And the modernity that we inherit, the modernity that I've talked about in terms of its own historical conditions, is also the modernity which separates, as it separated races, it separates senses. So that the legacies of the modern museum are the legacies of an idea of visuality separated from all its other senses, and rather beautifully depicted here. Now the visuality, and I think we saw this a lot in Shuda's talk as well, visuality is intimately connected to colonialism. The visual allows colonialism to happen in a way that the haptic cannot to the same extent. Yeah? You can occupy land with your gaze with eliminating people who you simply don't want to see. And if you think about the early depictions of colonial lands, they're often uninhabited. They're uninhabited because those people are being eliminated by the gaze. And once they're eliminated by the gaze, and this we know repeats all the way through, including into the Holocaust, yeah? Eliminating from the gaze leads to elimination in reality. So a museum that is focused on the visual to the exclusion of the other senses, indeed a discipline like visual art, which is focused on the visual to the exclusion of the other senses, is itself at least a problem that we need to ask. A problem that we need to ask in relationship to the colonialism which visually divided Albania without the haptic touch of the land, which would have made sense. So what I'm going to do now, as I have 3 minutes left, is to talk quite quickly about 3 projects to try and make it a little bit concrete. I thought I would have got here earlier, but I didn't, so I'm apologetic. 15 minutes is really tight. So what do we do as an institution in response to this? One is to try and take a distance from that modernity itself, to, in a sense, demodernize our collection by no longer understanding it to be a living tradition, but it's a tradition which has already passed. To, in some senses, simply to anthropologize modern art, and to make it a product of a system, of a society, and not the product of an artist as a genius. So this exhibition, The Making of Modern Art, which we did together with the Museum of American Art, very simply constructs a narrative beginning in the auction houses of the 17th century and taking us through the Louvre to Alexander Dorner, the 2 fathers, male fathers, obviously, of the Modern Art Museum, Alexander Dorner and Alfred Barr. In a way, deconstructing or thinking about this map, which is the foundation of all modern museums. Yeah? The Museum of Modern Art in America becomes, after the Second World War, the Al-Qaeda center, if you like, of the modern art museum movement, yes, in which people are not disciplined to follow, but nevertheless follow in the main this structure because they share an ideology. Now, it's an ideology which has many points, and I want to make this clear. a move to demodernize this is not to simply wipe it clean and try to start again. It's to see, for instance, what happens if you see these red rectangles here, which are the only references to the non-European world. Yeah, Japanese prints, Near Eastern art, Negro sculpture, machine aesthetic, and also modern architecture is a black rectangle at the bottom. These 4 and 5, and they have obviously different intentions, but these 5, it's very important that they're present in this diagram. Yeah, later diagrams by other directors of other museums tended to exclude them, but Barr was aware of this relationship. He was looking in the mirror, and at least at the periphery, at least blocked out as a rectangle, he was aware that modernism was formed by influences which was outside of a European tradition. But what happens if we open these up now? I don't think he could have done it at the time. There's no accusation against Barr here. The fact that it's there is important, but it allows us as an institution to open up Japanese prints or Near Eastern art or Negro sculpture or machine aesthetic and to understand the living traditions that they are. Because in a sense, they're presented here as dead archival matter to inspire the life that's present in the diagram. But these are not dead. You know, when the sculptures, often from Congo actually, which Renzo will talk about in a bit, 1 minute, when those sculptures were being bought and inspiring Braque and Picasso and so further, they were by contemporary artists in the Congo, but they were never documented as such, and they were never documented as such partly because of this kind of thinking. So what we do, and I'll skip through this, is to try and open that question up through decontextualizing. And then maybe very quickly 2 points. One is that the museum no longer becomes a site of the gaze, but a site of discourse, a site of discussion. And that means that we build certain spaces. So this is a reconstruction of the Kurdish parliament, which was set up in the north of Syria quite recently, and Jonas Stahl was the beginning of it. And this started an interesting movement within Eindhoven, where a number of people are now using this to gather and to find ways of talking politically in ways which are not really relevant to the museum so much, but are relevant to the city. Yes, that we become a civic space of gathering. And these are other examples. And then finally, I just want to show you one example, just 30 seconds, which is a project by Li Mu, who's a Chinese artist, who took our collection for reasons that I haven't got time to explain, but essentially wanting to show his family and his villages, where he comes from, what he was doing being an artist, and took our collection and copied it and presented it in his home village. And what happens is we have the Warhol mouths, so these go on the walls. The Dan Flavin is remade and mounted outside, the Solowit you can see here, and I'm just going to take you through one example, the Marina Abramovich as well. You see this Solowit on the back of the wall here. This was also copied. So the whole collection was copied. Yeah? It wasn't actually taken, it was copied. And then what happens is this is installed here. But of course, once you make one copy, you can make others. So then other things start to get done with it. So the work becomes a kind of functional aspect of the village itself. And I think that this demodernizing, in a sense, in this de-autonomizing, this taking the artistic autonomy, political autonomy is another thing, the artistic autonomy out of these works and setting them in a different context is one way that we, within a museum, can start to think about how transcultural artistic exchange can be made meaningful with the legacies that we have. Thank you very much.